The European Union has announced a tough set of tariffs on imported Chinese electric cars. It's part of a long-running trade dispute between two of the world's biggest economies. So, what impact is that going to have on Europe's green transition? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, transport accounts for nearly a quarter of CO2 emissions worldwide. Electric vehicles will be key to getting to net zero emissions by 2050. But Brussels says Beijing hasn't been playing fair and is introducing tariffs on Chinese EVs. So is this the start of a new trade dispute?
Electric vehicles made in China are now more expensive in Europe. An EU probe found significant and unfair Chinese state subsidies and responded with increased taxes.
These tariffs are not punitive tariffs. So like other countries have done, these are tariffs that legal or equal the given tariffs.
Different companies are being taxed at different rates based on the state financing each has allegedly received. Still, these are substantially less than the 100% tariffs imposed on Chinese EVs in the US. Ahead of the planned increases, China maintained it had done nothing wrong.
China has principles that must be defended, namely WTO rules and market principles, and interests that must be maintained, namely the legitimate rights and interests of China's electric vehicle industry and enterprises. To this end, we will resolutely take all necessary measures.
In retaliation, China is opening an anti-dumping investigation into European pork products. The transition to greener technologies is not only good for the planet, but also the balance sheets of industry-leading companies, to the tune of $10 trillion. So who will ultimately profit, and who will be left behind?
Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Brussels is Linlin Liang. She is Director of Communications and Research at the China Chamber of Commerce to the EU. Keith Pilbeam is a Professor of Economics at City University of London. In Wales, we have Gavin Harper. He's a Critical Materials Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. And here with me in the studio is Dimitri Zenghelis. He's a partner at the consultancy firm Independent Economics and a special advisor at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Linlin, I'll come to you first. So about a decade ago, the European Union kind of learned a very difficult lesson. It didn't put any tariffs on Chinese solar panels, and the industry effectively collapsed in Europe. Is that what's driving this kind of trade war with China now, that they're worried you're going to get the upper hand with EVs?
Well, we can see that a lot of things going on regarding the trade, and the difference between the current EV investigation and the one with the solar panel is that at that time, China's solar panel industry was already a dominant role. It's already a dominant player globally and in the US market. And now the problem with the EV sector is that actually China and Europe are highly interlinked, and the two sides are highly independent on each other's sides. So we don't see the similarities between the two cases, but the same thing would be that the protectionism move from the EU side.
Keith, who do you think holds the cards here? Who has the upper hand, the Chinese or the European Union?
Well, the Chinese there's no doubt they've invested heavily in this sector. Some years ago, they could see electric vehicles was the way to go. There's estimates that they put around 230 billion of state support behind these car manufacturers in China, which is huge. So obviously they've invested a lot in this sector, and they need European exports. It's a crucial market for them. In fact, it's their biggest export market. From the EU's perspective, we need electric cars, and we need them to be cheap, to be honest. So slapping tariffs on them, which is what the EU is threatening to do, possibly from tomorrow, the initial stages, and then there'll be a bit of negotiation. A lot of it is threat. Now, what Europe would like, I think, is a bit more of a production to be based in Europe. And so they could vary the tariffs up or down a little bit. So both have got power, but trade disputes rarely end up good for both sides in the end, because for Europeans it would mean higher car prices. And if you want to get greenhouse emissions down and all these kind of things, then clearly you need more electric vehicles. It's the way to go. So I think there's going to be a lot of negotiating on both sides to try and come to some sort of agreement rather than that. And of course, Beijing has got the ability to impose tariffs on European goods if they're not happy. And we need their markets as well, for our goods. So it rarely ends up well, trade disputes like this. So the best thing is negotiation, in my opinion.
I just want to go back to Linlin on that figure, £230 billion. Do you accept that's a fair figure in terms of what the Chinese government has put into investment in EVs?
Well, I think both sides already really put a lot of the incentives in these markets, and then I believe that a lot of incentives, so policy supportive measures, and so I want to quote another data to echoing what the professor just mentioned, and indeed that Europe is a primary destination for Chinese EV export. But on the other hand, I would like to raise the awareness that actually Chinese domestic market consume far more EVs than the European market and the other global markets combined. So the 500,000 EVs that China exported to the Europe only account around 5% of all the volume that the Chinese EVs produce in 2023.
Thanks, Linlin. Gavin, what's your take? Who has the upper hand here, China or the European Union?
Well, I think from my perspective, one of the things that China has been really proactive in doing is securing access to the critical raw materials that are essential for the production of electric vehicles. China dominates the production of rare earth magnets that are used in the motors of electric vehicles. Also, through the Silk Road, they've secured access to lots of the materials like cobalt, nickel and lithium that are used in the production of electric vehicle batteries. And really, if you haven't got access to these materials, you're going to struggle to produce electric vehicles. Now, in this respect, Europe, the West, the UK is very much playing catch up in trying to establish the supply chains for these materials and key components. And I think in this respect, China very much holds a trump card. What we're trying to do is to find ways to secure access to these materials through developing secondary streams, so recycling, for example.
Dimitri, just come in on that. Do you agree with what Gavin was just saying there? The Chinese are way ahead of Europe.
Way ahead of Europe. And, the Chinese have made a very important strategic decision that we should learn from in investing significant sums of money to develop technologies in sectors which are likely to grow very rapidly and which are subject to what's called Wright's law, which is basically the more you invest in deploying them, the cheaper they become, because you learn by doing and you scale up your production, so the unit cost of any one of these things goes down. As a result of which, the cost of batteries, which is the main component in an electric vehicle, have fallen, lithium-ion batteries have fallen by about 80% over the last decade. And that's what's driving the cost reductions. Solar PV, similar cost reductions. So putting taxpayers' money into these industries makes perfect sense if you're seeking to capture the markets and technologies of tomorrow. The future's not in combustion engines. Wang Gang, who is a car industrialist who worked for Audi, I think, initially, became, I believe, science minister in China. He realized very quickly that China's not going to compete with the West on combustion engines because they are many years ahead, and that the world is going to move away from oil. So it makes strategic sense for China to invest heavily in electric vehicles. And they are cornering the market. The Europeans should learn from this, because now, of course, we're worried about European jobs and European car makers. Well, we should have been a little bit more proactive, like the Chinese were.
So China has a huge head start?
Absolutely, they have a huge head start, and it's an exactly appropriate use of public money to subsidize sectors that are likely to grow in the future. This isn't a case of dumping. This isn't a case of overcapacity. As you know, China's market in electric vehicles is bigger than the rest of the world put together. I think it's almost twice as big as the rest of the world put together. So China has invested in a sector that is future-proofed, and they are going to be rewarded for that, and I think all credit to them. And I think the lesson we need to learn is not the reactive one of imposing tariffs to prevent access to cheap technologies. It's about finally getting up to speed so that we can produce similar goods and services across the spectrum of clean technologies.
Linlin, what do you think the Chinese government will do now in retaliation? Because France, for example, sells a lot of red wine and cognac to Chinese middle-class people, a lot of luxury goods made in Europe. Chinese citizens want to buy them. Can you see a situation where Beijing puts tariffs on those kind of exports?
Well, I mean, around the EU's decision to impose the countervailing duties, we already seen some measures from Beijing that the Chinese, well, based on the industry's complaints that China initiated the anti-dumping investigation into the EU's agri-food sector. And there were also discussion that China should impose 25% tariffs on the EU's large engine car exporting to China. So there were a lot of talks about what China could retaliate if there are high duties in place. But we want to emphasize is that this kind of escalation and the tit-for-tat measures and like a trade conflict would be in interest of no parties.
That's a good point, Keith, isn't it? A trade war, you said earlier, it's going to benefit nobody.
Yeah, and especially at the moment, you know, because the Chinese economy has got other problems and, you know, Europe is not exactly in the best state, you know, with the increased national debts and all this kind of thing. And so people are getting taxed more. And what we do know is that when you impose tariffs, what do? You basically raise the price. And also, some manufacturers won't bother to export to you anyway. So you also reduce the variety. And, you know, we need a range of electric cars. I mean, you've got some more upmarket ones, obviously, but the price is too high. The Chinese actually produce the cheaper type cars. They sell them in their own market for around 20,500, some of them. And the equivalent models in Europe are already 42,000 euros. So the point is that, you know, they're already relatively expensive in Europe because they face tariffs and they actually make more profit on their European sales. I mean, they only make about 1,500 euros on the domestic sales. They're making something like 14,000 on their European sales. So they need the European market because there's quite intense competition in China. So I think there's room for negotiation. I just don't think a trade dispute is going to be in either party's interest. What we know, you know, when we teach international economics to our students is that tariffs rarely end up well. And they just push up people's cost of living. We've got cost of living. We want adoption. So I just think there's plenty of room for negotiation here and come to some sort of meaningful settlement for both parties.
What would that look like, Gavin?
Well, I think the thing that we need to bear in mind is issues of national competitiveness aside, as a human race, we face this challenge of decarbonisation and moving towards zero carbon technologies. And really, we need everyone to do very well at that. Now, I think, you know, in the UK, although we may be a little bit behind the curve in terms of, you know, electric vehicle and electric vehicle battery manufacture, we've got some fantastic assets in science and innovation. There's been some stellar investments in battery innovation through the Faraday Institution. I think there's lots of new things that are coming online that could help us to reduce our critical materials demand through newer, smarter batteries, through recycling the materials that go into electric vehicle motors, etc. And I think we really need to look at ways of working together to increase the uptake of low carbon technologies, you know, and that should involve cooperation and collaboration.
Dimitri, do you think one solution here is maybe the EU and China having a conversation and the EU saying, OK, you can make your electric cars, but do it in European Union countries where we want to create employment?
Well, employment, and we actually also want to share the technologies. And actually, you know, this is a case conventionally, it's been a case of Western technologies, the Chinese seeking access to Western technologies. Well, when you put a lot of money into a sector, you stimulate innovation, you stimulate knowledge and learning by doing, you become the technology leader. These are not, bad cars that are be dunked on European markets. These are incredibly technologically sophisticated products, and they're very competitive. And I think, Europe has been slow on the uptake. And the European car market, because it didn't make the necessary commitment to turn towards electric vehicles, is lagging behind global markets. And I think this is a way to help Europe get back up to speed. So I absolutely think that having domestic production facilities and technology transfers that go both ways, and they do go both ways. I mean, you talked at the beginning about solar PV. The Germans don't really have a case for complaining about the fact that the Chinese now fabricate and export solar PV. They did put a lot of German taxpayer money into developing the PV industry in Germany. But once the production moved to China, the Germans then supplied the capital goods to help produce that. They supplied the technology. They supplied a lot of the intellectual know-how to allow the Chinese to set up these production facilities, and they made money out of that. So you have to think across the entire spectrum of the supply line in order to understand that everybody can stand to benefit by taking advantage of what are ultimately going to be one of the fastest growing markets in the world. And tariffs, as we said already, are just going to gum up that process and make it harder for anyone to make money, and make it harder for us as consumers to have good, cheap, highly performing products.
And Dimitri, I noticed that the Germans do not want these tariffs because they sold 1/3 of their vehicles manufactured in Germany last year was sold in China. So China and Germany do a lot of business.
And it's no coincidence that of all the European players who are most vociferously against tariffs, it's the car producers in Germany, because they still have markets, mostly in combustion engine cars, but increasingly in electric vehicles. So, I mean, that tells you something about the commercial viability and the commercial sense of imposing these kinds of tariffs. Now, that's not to say that tariffs don't always, in every way have a role. Sometimes they do. They are a good disincentive for dumping. Which, in the past, China has been accused of through overcapacity and all the rest of it. It just does not apply to these dynamic sectors where investment brings the cost down and generates whole new markets, whole new technologies, and whole new behaviours. And we need to encourage that, and not least for the climate imperatives that we've already spoken about.
Linlin, I just want to come back to you. The United States government is looking at putting 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. What's the feeling from the Chinese perspective about all of these tariffs? Do you feel it's unfair?
Well, this is also a different case. Well, because China doesn't export so many EV cars to the United States directly. So this 100% tariffs from the United States is more of a symbolic move. It's quite different with what the EU proposed to imposing on the Chinese EVs. And I agree with other guests that actually we want to point it out, over half of the Chinese EVs exported to Europe. They're actually the European American brands, and they are subject to the tariff hikes in the future. So that is one thing we would like to remind. It's a completely different case with the United States. And on the other hand, the United States' decision to impose 100% tariffs is based on this kind of there's ongoing trade war between the two sides. So if you are not for the trade war between the two sides, it's probably the tariff thing will be the least thing to do.
Thanks, Linlin. Well, China says it reserves the right to file a suit with the World Trade Organization over the EU's planned new tariffs on imports of its EVs. Here is what the Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesperson said on the matter recently.
The actions by the European side are suspected of violating WHO rules and are naked protectionist behaviour. China reserves the right to file a suit to the WHO and take all necessary measures to resolutely defend the rights and interests of Chinese companies. The determination disclosed in the EU's ruling lack a factual and legal basis. This action not only harms the legal rights and interests of the Chinese electric vehicle industry and undermines mutually beneficial EU cooperation on new energy vehicles, but will also distort auto production and supply chains around the world, including in the European Union.
Keith, we all know that the green transition is hugely important. What kind of an impact do you think this will have, a trade row between the European Union and China, while everyone in Europe is being told that we need to be greener and that the future is electric vehicles?
Well, I think governments have got to send a clear message. And if you start saying we're going to block electric vehicles that are nice and cheap that you could use, it doesn't send a very consistent message, does it? And of course, it's protectionist. What we're going to keep more, German cars using combustion engines on the road because we're going to restrict that. It's all very mixed, isn't it? And I think that we have to be consistent. Governments have to. I mean, we've seen the chaos in Britain that when governments are all over the place flip-flopping on things. So if you're saying we're heading to green energy, we need you to adopt electric vehicles, then allow cheap electric vehicles in the country. I mean, it's overwhelmingly the case. It's going to help hit your greenhouse targets and, improve people's lives in a way, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. And blocking choice is never a good thing. It's never a good thing in economics. We benefit hugely from international trade both ways. You've got to learn to compete. It's clear that we're behind the curve. But blocking competition in the past has never helped out, because the Chinese will just continue to innovate and be ahead of us, stay ahead of us, while we're just protecting our existing car manufacturers. Well, it doesn't work out in the end. It always ends up in disaster. The Americans tried that, of course, in the, with Japan with the cars, and they all ended up bankrupt, if you remember. Yeah. And it was the Japanese that had good credit ratings and everything, because the tariffs didn't work, and they won't work in this case either, because it doesn't stimulate innovation, competition, and competition is international these days.
Gavin, just give us your take on the impact towards the green transition, if you will, please.
So governments around the world have committed to decarbonisation. We have a new UK government after 14 years of Conservative rule. It will be really interesting to see what the future direction is around UK industrial strategy and decarbonisation. I think, Keith's comments previously in a UK context are interesting. We've got lots of investment in internal combustion engine innovation historically. What we need to do is to make that pivot. We're in a position where lots of our domestic vehicle producers are foreign owned. Isn't there an opportunity for foreign direct investment from China? The one thing that I would caution, though, is that we need to ensure that we protect ourselves against vulnerability. I think, when there's a monopoly supplier in the marketplace, there's challenges then around resilience. We've seen some of the challenges around globalisation and international supply chains through COVID, through the war in Ukraine, etc. And I think, there is a need to build domestic resilience, but we should also be looking for those opportunities for collaboration and working together for decarbonisation.
Dimitri, messaging on this is very important, is it? Everyone in Europe to drive towards the green transition. What I keep hearing from people is, I'd love to buy an EV, but they're very expensive. Surely this kind of solves the problem.
Well, this is one of the beauties of technologies such as this. We are now going to have cheaper, better performing cars, not only, in terms of over the lifetime of the car, but also the actual car itself is now it's about to undercut and will soon very clearly undercut the combustion engine. There are issues with range, there are issues with access to charging points. All of those will, in due course, be ironed out. We've seen solar PV and wind provide cheaper energy, even when you account for grid integration costs, than conventional fossil fuels, coal and gas for the most part. So the conventional story here is, we want to do the right environmental thing, but it's going to cost us. It's going to cost us money. It's going to cost us jobs. It's going to cost us growth and productivity. The truth is, for some of these fundamental sectors, and we've already seen it in electricity, we've already seen it in cars, we will see it in many more sectors. These technologies are far more innovative, efficient, and productive than what they're replacing. The fact of the matter is, burning stuff is a really inefficient way to generate energy, and we've known that for a long time. The only reason we've stuck with this 19th century technology is because there's a lot of incumbency and a lot of inertia that resists change. The tariffs are part of that process. And what's wonderful is we are finally seeing that actually, in many senses, going clean is not just going to deliver a cleaner, quieter, more secure and environmentally sustainable world. It will deliver a more innovative, a more efficient and a more productive one as well. So we start to resolve some of our issues with productivity, and it's productivity that generates wage growth and income growth. So actually, this is a commercial imperative. The Chinese did this not to save the planet. They might have done, I don't know. But the main reason they did this is because they saw the commercial opportunity. It was commercial self-interest. And the quicker that we get on board with this and stop talking about going clean as being some sort of burden and start thinking about it as an opportunity, the faster we're going to decarbonize and the better off we're going to be for it.
So it's a mindset reshift.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
If you tell everybody this is eye-wateringly expensive, are they likely to invest? If they're an investor or a politician, almost certainly not, right? They'll wait for somebody else to do it before them. So they're going to free ride on the actions of others. If, on the other hand, you tell them actually the costs are coming down like a stone, the finance is going from niche to mainstream, and by the way, this is one of the fastest growing markets in the world, you're more likely to invest. Now, here's the trick. It's the investment that generates the learning by doing and the economies of scale that brings the cost down. So mindsets are critically important because this has a habit of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once people realize the opportunities will avail themselves.
Gavin, Keith, Linlin and Dimitri, thank you all for your insight and analysis. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World, and if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.